Hi, welcome to the China Leadership Dilemma podcast. I want you to imagine for a moment that you're an American working for a multinational company and you have been selected for an expat assignment in China. So, how do you prepare for what lies ahead? How do you develop the soft skills that you need to communicate effectively or to inspire and to lead Chinese people? And how do you make better decisions when the cultural context in China is so different than what you're accustomed to in the United States? Of course, it's not possible to learn everything before you land in Pudong International Airport. So what can you do to prepare yourself for success? Well, what would have benefited me tremendously when I first arrived in Shenzhen in 2004, or when I first arrived in Shanghai in 2011 as an expat, was to develop a different way of thinking and perceiving. In other words, how do I adjust my attitude, mindset, and approach to improve how I am perceived by others? Now, before you read anything or study anything about Chinese business or Chinese culture, before you meet your local staff, before you arrange your first meeting with your local partners, before you do anything, you need to develop a foundation for understanding how Chinese people think and what they value. So in this episode, I'm going to try to help you imagine what it's like to communicate with Chinese people. So I think for most Americans, we have an opinion about our current president, Donald Trump. So this is not to make any kind of political statement, whether you like him or you dislike him. Basically, what we want to try to do is we want to try to understand or imagine how we would proceed to build a relationship with Donald Trump. The reason that I think that Donald Trump is a good example is because when we are trying to figure out how to navigate the complexities across foreign cultures, and especially two cultures that are so diametrically opposed. So if you study anything about Hofstede's cultural dimensions, you know, the US or Americans and Chinese are generally at opposite ends of the spectrum, whether it's uncertainty avoidance or power distance or whatever cultural dimensions you want to measure. Chinese and Americans are generally at opposite ends. And so one of the ways to develop empathy for people who grew up in a different environment and don't think like you and don't share the same values as you is to try to be empathetic. And in order to be empathetic with somebody, you have to use your imagination. So we're not going to be able to get into all the details of how I would guide a client through this journey, but I just want you to begin by using your imagination on trying to communicate with Donald Trump. So what I perceive is Donald Trump thinks in a very circular manner, as opposed to most Americans who think in more in a linear fashion. So thinking linearly, it means that there's a cause and there's an effect, there's a process, and things proceed in a predictable sequential manner. For a circular thinker, the challenge of communicating with circular thinkers is what they think and what they really feel is something inside, but what you perceive is how they react to things on the surface. So for most people trying to analyze Donald Trump and how he thinks and what his positions are, it's generally very difficult. And the reason is because Donald Trump is more of a circular thinker. Another way to say that is Donald Trump is very emotional with what he feels and what he believes. So if you disagree with, let's say you disagree with Donald Trump's tweets, well, what he tweets is an emotional reaction based on something maybe that he feels deep inside, but something triggered an emotional reaction, and what you perceive is maybe just something on the surface. And what we advise our clients is if you engage with somebody on the surface, then you will never be able to bridge the cultural differences. So in this case of an example where Donald Trump is thinking more like a Chinese person, to react to some of his tweets or even some of his rhetoric or some of his words or even some of his stated positions, that's going to lead nowhere. And I think most people on the left have realized that trying to communicate with Donald Trump generally leads nowhere. And for an American doing business in China, you will discover this phenomenon a lot, where people don't seem to say what they mean and mean what they say. And I always advise my American colleagues that the first thing you want to do is you never want to judge this phenomenon, because it's very culturally embedded in the Chinese culture. Chinese has 1,000 years of history and culture that revolves around this system of reciprocity. And this system of reciprocity involves the giving and receiving of face as the foundation or the basis of forming guanxi relationships. So if anybody has heard the term face, now it's used a lot in international relations or politics, giving and receiving face by definition, to give somebody face by definition is actually to be disingenuous, because the purpose of giving face is to say something to make somebody feel good, to boost somebody's ego per se. Another way of thinking about it is telling a white lie. It's not what you really think, but you want to be kind or you want to be nice because you want to make the other person feel good. That's a little bit like what it means to give face, but in the Chinese culture, giving face is taken to a completely different level. So you just have to imagine. You can even see it in the news cycle, where a lot of foreign leaders want to give Donald Trump face because they know that if they don't, then there's going to be an immediate repercussion. He's going to immediately go on the attack by Twitter. So in order to communicate effectively with Donald Trump, well, you have to be disingenuous. You may not want to share your opinions exactly as you feel, because you know that ultimately is not going to lead to a positive result. So for people doing business in China, the first lesson is just to try to imagine what it would be like to communicate with Donald, who is very emotional, who thinks in a very circular manner, who cares a lot about his face, both giving face and receiving face. I mean, yes, Russia is not an ally of the United States, and Donald Trump knows that. And whether you believe there was meddling in the election or whether there's collusion between the Trump administration and the Russians, it doesn't really matter what you believe. Just look at how Donald Trump communicates with his counterpart in Russia. Giving praise while it's frowned upon by all of the geopolitical experts in the United States, and congratulating Putin on his election victory, even though we know that it was rigged and there's no true elections in Russia. Well, saying those things is Donald Trump's way of giving face, because if you can emotionally make somebody feel better, you have a much better chance of connecting on a deeper level. You have a much better chance of that person demonstrating a little bit more flexibility in return to you. It's almost like giving and receiving face really has nothing to do with the outcome. It's basically just how you start the conversation. And when you are doing business in China, you have to be very cognizant of what you actually perceive, because more than likely as a foreigner, the Chinese are at two extremes. They're either at the extreme where they're telling you what they think you want to hear, or they're at the other extreme and they're trying to express a disagreement with a very, very strongly worded disagreement or position. And these are the extremes. These are the only extremes that you will generally encounter. One is very polite, very just telling you what you want to hear, praising you, making you feel good. And the other is just being almost kind of in complete disagreement with a certain way of proceeding. And of course, because there's a language difference and there are cultural barriers, the Chinese generally don't know the most tactful way to articulate something that they feel wouldn't work, and it's dangerous if you make a negative assumption about the way they communicate, because you just imagine if you are trying to speak Chinese as a second language and you're forced to communicate in that language. You have to be empathetic with how difficult it is for Chinese to really express their true feelings in English, because I know that we have a business meeting in English because there are foreigners who don't speak Chinese, and then after the meeting I'm talking with my Chinese counterparts in Chinese, and what they articulated in English generally doesn't match what they were trying to say in Chinese or what they feel in Chinese. They're doing the best they can. So I'm fluent in Chinese, so it's easier for me to be empathetic to the source of what they're trying to say. But even that, even though I have 20 years of experience in China, even though I speak fluent Mandarin Chinese, it's still a continuous learning journey for me to develop greater empathy for a broader spectrum of Chinese people who come from different regions, who are in different age demographics. It's really something that you have to develop as a skill, which is empathy, and it takes time. So over the course of these podcasts, we're going to actually develop a framework for making each one of your interactions in China kind of an opportunity to develop what we call the essential soft skills that matter. One is empathy, which is what other people think and what other people feel. And the other is awareness, and self-awareness is really important. Understanding how the way you present yourself is perceived by other people. Because in China, people are going to give you face, so you rarely will know what they really think. And that's a dangerous combination. Being myopic, not knowing what you don't know, and walking away from a meeting thinking because of all the praise that you receive that people actually were attracted to, or they bought into what you proposed. And generally, especially for first-time visitors, that's a danger, because you will be led down the wrong path. Not necessarily led down to the wrong path of making a good business decision, but led down to the wrong path of believing something that just isn't true. Believing that people respect you, people think highly of you, people value your opinion and value your ideas. A lot of times you're just the boss, and behind the scenes they are trying to mold you and shape your opinion, because they actually believe your opinion is completely disconnected with the realities on the ground in China. And a lot of times they are actually right. So I don't want to let this podcast get too long, but I just want you to understand how important two things are to developing the essential soft skills that matter. One is imagination, but it has to be a positive imagination, which you're non-judgmental. And the other is a purpose-driven curiosity, which in communications means you're asking questions not just actively, but you're asking questions proactively. It's going from passive listening to active listening to what I call proactive listening, where you really want to empathize and understand what people think and what they value, and how best to understand where they are coming from. And the beginning of this journey is just to imagine what it's like to communicate with Donald Trump as a microcosm of trying to communicate with Chinese people in mainland China in general. Okay? So I hope this triggers your imagination. That's really the only thing that we can do in these podcasts, is just give you different ways to imagine the situations that you are involved with daily, and how you can develop greater empathy and awareness through those engagements that you have. Okay? Thank you very much. This is episode 1, Why Donald Trump is Chinese.